So myself and a friend had something happen the other day. I left another friend's house about 4 a.m. Its dark street lights have just come back on. They get turned off at 1 a.m. every day, back on 4 a.m. every day to save money. And it's a clear night, a couple of clouds in the sky. It looks nice with the moon and all. Anyways, my friend and I were walking for just 2 minutes. We go around the corner of the road. It's a dead-end road, one way in, one way out, and it goes downhill. And in front of us, about 50 meters away, were 5 people. 2 children, what looks like the parents, and an elderly woman. It's a bit odd to see a family out at 4 a.m. standing under a streetlight. Not impossible to happen. People are unpredictable. As we got closer, they looked really odd. White shirts, beige trousers, and dresses. Exactly the same colors. Again, not impossible, just odd. Getting closer, across the road from them, we saw how daunting they looked. Black rings around their eyes. They didn't look healthy. Sunken faces. Quite creepy, but even creepier when they just stare. Eyes followed us the whole way. My friend, who is female, was clearly terrified as something really wasn't sitting well with them. So we walked on a bit faster. I grabbed her closer to me just in case anything happened. I would rather she get away safe. So we carried on for literally seconds before a stone flew by and hit the pavement in front of us. It made us jump. My friend was even more scared now. I got annoyed, so I turned to confront them, and they were gone. They were there mere seconds before and were completely gone from where they were. There was nowhere to hide so fast. There are no other ways out of that road. They would have to run past us to get away. We ran down the road away from where they were, friends crying. I was getting tense, I hate dark, and honestly I was scared too. So I told her to hold on to me, stay close, and move to a walk as we got further down the road. The road itself takes about 10 minutes to walk down. We were probably 6 minutes in, but looked behind us constantly. We got to the end of the road, turned around again. Nothing. But the lights turned off, only for about 20 seconds. Now we are submerged in darkness, barring what we can see at the end of the road by a bus stop. And at that bus stop we saw 5 people, 2 children, their parents, and the elderly woman, just standing there staring. We had nowhere else to go. I called my friends to see if they were awake, but their phones were dead, so I couldn't contact anyone. My friends were still scared, so was I. But I started to get angry and scared, so I marched towards them to ask, "Why are you playing around?" The lights turned back on, made me jump. I looked around, grabbed my friend, went to head towards them again, and they were gone. I still have their faces and clothing all imprinted in my mind. My friend doesn't understand what happened, and I for sure don't. We've tried to talk to friends about it, but they think the darkness tricked our minds. It's something I can't stop thinking about, and I dream about it. It gives me nightmares, and I can barely sleep since. I was about 10 years old, living outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. Thanksgiving had just passed, and it was particularly cold that year. I can't remember why my mother and older brother weren't at home at the time, but my father, a barber in the city, was upstairs getting ready for work. I had just set up a new dartboard I got as an early Christmas present from distant family at Thanksgiving earlier in the week when I heard a car door slam and tires burn out quite loudly. Running to the door to peek outside, my vision of the intersection is blocked by a tree. My father, hearing my footsteps in a hurry, yells down, "It's just that kid down the street. He's about to buy new tires, so he's roasting the ones he's got." I go back to throwing darts, and just a few moments later, as my 10-year-old brain is reasoning the logic my father had yelled down, I think to myself, why did he slam the door, though? As I'm holding on to this thought, I hear the sound of glass clinking together. It gets louder, and has a beat to it, like if you took a bag of marbles and hit them like a drum. For what I can only explain as intuition, this seemingly harmless sound absolutely terrifies me in the moment. One last pause, and then it meets me on the other side of my door. I'm paralyzed with fear as a man begins pounding on the door. I'm only feet away and at an angle I can't see out clearly. I scream at the top of my lungs for my father. I hear him racing down the stairs as my ridiculous self is on autopilot, opening up the front door for some messed up reason. My dad lands directly behind me. Having jumped down the last staircase due to my gut-wrenching scream, the door wide open now reveals a young black man completely naked, beaten, bloodied, taped at the mouth, and tied from head to toe in old-fashioned glass Christmas lights. He falls into our doorway. My father immediately slams the door and locks it. My fear is completely gone. This man is crying, talking through the tape tied into a fetal position on our floor. I reach down to take the tape off, and as I do, my father grabs me and launches me up onto the upper staircase's landing. "Call 911 now." I sprint for the upstairs phone and dial 911. I'm sounding off every detail and fact I think they need to know. As I'm headed back downstairs, my father has thrown an old navy Pia coat over the man, finally calms himself for the first time in a long time. As the tape comes off, he busts out into a full-fledged howling cry. The kind of cry you cry from your stomach, from your soul. My dad looks away. He cried like that, still tied up with the pea coat over him until the cops got there 10 minutes later. Even they couldn't get him untied. I overheard an officer say to another that he must have been tied like that for a while, as the smaller cord was embedded in his skin. An officer talking to my father pointed at me and told me to get in the house. They walked up onto our porch just enough for me to hear their conversation behind the door. The man, 32 years old, had pulled over to the side of the road to help a stranded motorist, someone who he thought was alone but had an accomplice hiding nearby. When this good Samaritan offered his help in changing the flat tire, he was knocked over the head and put into the trunk of the car. The two men took him to an abandoned building and first tied him up with rope. They repeatedly beat and raped him for 3 days until he escaped, only to be captured on the road, and this time tied up with the Christmas lights. This went on for weeks, apparently. How long, I'm still not sure. As we never got this man's name and it was never reported in the news, my dad called the police station a few days later, but no one would tell him a thing. I remember the tire marks in our intersection stayed there for what seemed like years. It was already dark in the late afternoon when my brother and I arrived in the small town of Grand Rapids, Minnesota. It was December and bitterly cold. The reason for the visit was to spend Christmas with our grandma. She was well into her 90s, so it was reasonable to assume each holiday would be the last. As it happened, this one was. I'm the youngest of 4 brothers. At the time, I was living in Minneapolis. My parents also lived there, but they were splitting their time between Minnesota and Arizona. Currently, they were in Phoenix and hadn't planned to return to Minnesota for the holidays. Knowing our grandma would be alone, I had called my brother in Chicago and suggested he grab me so we could head up north together, where our grandma had been staying at an assisted living center. The trip was uneventful, and we had a pleasant Christmas Eve, doing puzzles and chatting with our grandma. As the night came to a close, we headed to our lodgings. My brother had made the accommodations beforehand. We'd be staying at the Rainbow Motel. The motel itself was unremarkable. It wasn't old, and it didn't appear foreboding from outside. Our room was clean and furnished with what you would expect: beds, a desk, some chairs, a television on a cabinet, and a small bathroom. I'd call it your standard cookie-cutter roadside motel. The room was fairly small. 2 beds lay side by side, with the door at roughly the foot of one of the beds. This was the bed my brother selected, so mine was a little bit further away from the door, but only perhaps by 7-8 feet. The motel was mostly empty, probably due to the holiday and it being the dead of winter. After checking in, we headed down to the bar, which only had a couple other people in it. At the time, I was partial to White Russians, and I had one that evening as a nightcap. We finished our drinks and headed back to the room. We knew we had a long drive the next day. I was tired, got undressed, and flopped onto my bed. My brother decided to watch TV. I wasn't interested, so I rolled over and closed my eyes. I don't remember when it started, but I want to say it was only a few moments after I'd lain down. It was only this: the door handle suddenly began to shake quite aggressively. I recall thinking this was strange, because it didn't sound like someone had mistaken this room for theirs and simply tried to open the door. The handle was being deliberately, violently shaken. I sat up and looked at the door, and then my brother. After a couple seconds, it stopped. We looked at each other, gave a collective shrug, and lay back down. Soon the noise started up again. Now I could understand someone, after a few glasses of eggnog, getting their room number wrong and trying the door to enter. But this was different. It was forceful. It was clear to me. The intention was not to open the door, but instead to let the person inside know that someone was out there. I thought perhaps it was kids playing a prank. I hadn't seen anyone in the motel, and it was well past 11 p.m., so it seemed odd that any children would be allowed to roam the halls. I got up and walked over to the door. We had heard no voices, no giggles, no closing doors or retreating footsteps. I looked out the door's peephole, which gave a decent view of the hallway, but saw no one. I opened the door and leaned out. Our room was near the center of the hall, and I could see the exits on both ends. I recall there was a hallway that split off perhaps 20 feet down to my left. I assumed this is where the prankers retreated to, as there wouldn't be enough time for them to run down the entire hallway and out one of the exits, or enter another room without us hearing a door to another room close. I looked for some other explanation. Was the door itself somehow causing the sound? Was it loose, and perhaps the wind or the pressure of the structure was making it shake? I closed the door and pushed it. It was very solid. I couldn't replicate the sounds, except by grabbing the handle and vigorously shaking it. This was getting annoying. I was tired and just wanted to sleep. I climbed back into bed, but I lay there like a coiled spring, waiting for whoever was pranking us to return. I'd enjoy catching them in act if they did. Sure enough, moments later the shaking started up again. I sprung up and was at the door in an instant and looked out the peephole again, certain to see some kids running down the hallway. But I saw no one. From the time the noises stopped to the time I was at the door was a couple seconds at most. The only way I couldn't have seen or heard. Someone was, if they were smart, enough to crouch down knowing I could not see anything directly under the peephole. I opened the door. No one was there. No one had been there. My brother and I are both skeptics. We were certain there was a reasonable explanation for this, but truth be told, I was beginning to get a little spooked. I had never experienced anything like this. It seemed to defy logic. Once again, I crawled into bed. But I was so unnerved, sleep seemed out of the question. I was upset I hadn't caught the pranksters, but was also dimly aware that there were none to be caught. Something was making this happen. Something unseen. Someone with a purpose. It scared me. I recall making a conscious decision to will the noise to stop. I closed my eyes tightly and focused on the thought, I don't want this to happen anymore. Enough. You've made your point. Whatever it might have been. Stop. Now. And it did. The door rattler didn't return. After a while, I relaxed it a little. My brother shut off the TV and turned out the lights. The silence of the room was complete. However, as the night wore on, I found myself woken up by other noises. I could hear the door chain moving. I could hear other unidentifiable sounds at the door. I didn't hear the door handle noise again, but all through the night, I was subjected to the repeated sounds of the door being fiddled with in some manner. A pattern emerged. I'd hear a sound, become terrified. It would stop, and I would drift off to sleep again. In the morning, my brother and I discussed what might have happened. All he would say was that we had visitors, and in the bright light of day, it all seemed a bit silly. What it might have been seemed not very important. I just wanted to go home. We checked out of the hotel and got on the road. Several hours later, we approached Minneapolis, the skyline looming in the distance. Not long after that, my brother dropped me at my apartment, and he carried on to Chicago. As I shifted back into my life, I placed the incident behind me and, aside from telling a few close friends, I simply moved on. A few months passed, and I went to visit my oldest brother who was living in Arizona. Years before, he'd lived in Grand Rapids and knew the Rainbow Motel, although he had never stayed there. I told him the story. All the while, he smiled at me as I related the story. It was a knowing smile that I at first mistook for disbelief. When I was done, he then told me our other brother, the one who had been in the motel with me, had recently visited and related the same story to him. I did not know this. He said our stories were essentially identical. I'd not spoken to him since he had dropped me off at my apartment. The next thing he said chilled me. As I've mentioned, he'd lived in Grand Rapids years before and naturally was very familiar with the town. He told me the Rainbow Motel, the place I found so plain and average, had a history of hauntings. I assume he had gotten this information from the locals he encountered while living there years ago. While my oldest brother likes to joke and tease, he is for the most part a stoic Midwesterner, not given to nonsense or deception. I believed him. Now, obviously, if I had been aware of this beforehand and the events of that night had played out as they had, I'd no doubt believe it was our imaginations that were to blame. But the fact that this motel was so unassuming, the location so mundane, and the building so very unremarkable leads me to believe that whatever happened that night was not something that had simply sprung from our imaginations. I'm still a skeptic. I like to think this could be explained without resorting to the supernatural. What I do know is this: it was real. It was terrifying, and I will never forget this experience. I currently live in a smaller rural town. It's pretty removed, but still has a lot of good shopping and eating options and public spaces. We even have a few breweries and bars now. It's a newly hip place, with farming on the outskirts so I can get my eggs and veggies fresh from the source. The pandemic really hurt business locally though, and pretty much the only regular delivery options was Walmart and Amazon for a minute. I was pretty stoked when much later more local options popped up on various apps. However, at this time, for main necessities and grocery items, there weren't any options besides getting a store delivery from the Walmart, a town over. This meant a lot of people we didn't know while popping through, and it drove some of the older folks crazy all over the neighborhood talking about cars and people they didn't recognize. I embraced it. It made my life easier. It was great for a bit. So at this point, I lived with my teenage son, who was a gangly 6'4", and my then boyfriend was staying to be near his elderly parents. He's 6'3" and broadly built. It's a tiny space, and I felt a little cramped with the big guys always around. So once in a while, I'd send them off on an errand, or they'd visit my boyfriend's parents and give me some space to work on things, or just enjoy being alone. One of those days, I got a delivery. I recognized the guy and said hi, tipped him well, went about my life. An hour later, he was back at my door. He was kind of weird. He was creepy because I have steps in front of my door, but no porch. He would knock and stand beside the steps where I couldn't see him through the eye hole. But I could see him through my window he was next to. So I talked through the window like, "Sup? Can I help you?" I have window film over the lower window for privacy, but I can stand on my couch and see through the upper window above people's heads and see outside, and the upper window pulls down too to let in air multiple ways. He kept trying to look for where my voice was coming from before answering and telling me he forgot a bag in the delivery. I confirmed I got it all and thanked him. He left. I didn't want to open the door again after he noticed I was alone. I got new neighbors directly in the unit across from me. They got a Ring camera. She reached out to me and told me someone came by knocking and had sat on my steps for about half an hour. I was down at my boyfriend's house with my son at the time, and she sent me the Ring cam video. It looked like that guy, and it was like 8 p.m. I didn't have any open orders either. I reached out to Walmart, and they were totally unhelpful. They told me they'd be making sure he didn't deliver anything to me in the future, but wouldn't give me any info I could pass on to security or the police in case anything further happened. I wanted to at least file a report with my security in case anything happened again because it felt really weird. But they told me the police would need to reach out. I had the feeling it would escalate, and it did. I didn't want to be home alone anymore. I didn't order delivery. I just tried to cover my bases. However, my neighbor did order a delivery, and somehow it came through that guy again. The creepy thing was, I heard it being dropped off and had the urge to look through the peephole and saw him standing right in front of my stairs, looking around my door and living room windows. He stood there for like 5 minutes until my neighbor upended the door to get her groceries, and I told her, "That's the guy from the Ring camera." She contacted Walmart too and asked he doesn't deliver anything anymore. A few weeks went by and Christmas was around the corner. I had ordered a few items from Amazon and they were all arriving together. I knew they were on my front porch. I could hear them dropped and the delivery guy knocked. I saw him walk off. My BF was on the couch with his headphones on working, and I was cooking dinner. I figured I'd grab them in a moment. They are fine on my steps at the moment. There's a camera there. If anything happens, it'll be 5 mins tops. I finished plating and brought the food in, and as I was setting the plates down, the front door knob, which wasn't locked, gave a tiny turn. The deadbolt was still latched, but the knob wasn't, and I could hear it. My BF couldn't. I stopped and pointed it out. My BF is completely oblivious to these kinds of things. He took his headphones off, peeking through the top window, and said, "Oh, you must be hearing things. No one's touching your doorknob. There's no one out there?" He walked over and ripped the door open to show me there's nothing there. But there's the guy again, crouched up against the wall under the window, hand still on the knob, trying to turn it silently. He looked modified to see him opening the door, and when my son came up too, he looked really confused. He asked for me. He must have known my name from the deliveries because he used the name I have on my account, which isn't the name everyone knows me by. My BF asked what he needed, and the guy reached down and picked up the Amazon box and said delivery, and handed out off and then left? It was really strange. I explained to my BF that he was not delivering those boxes. They were already there. We took the footage to the police, and I tried to reach out to Walmart. The police told me they reached out to Walmart and just got a bunch of clueless, basic customer service agents with no idea how to proceed, and that if he came back, I need to call them so they can get to him in person. I was really scared though. I was glad he knew I wasn't in the house alone now, but I felt like he might take more drastic measures knowing that too. So I was just running through every possible scenario. The sprinkler system automatically kicks in at 11 p.m. It cycles through the plot of land for an hour. It starts at my bedroom wall, which faces the parking lot. By midnight, it's gone around the entire space in tandem and reaches the front lawn space to the right of my front door. I'm in bed when I hear it click on. It's noisy because it hits gravel too. It covered up a lot of the sounds. When it switched off to the next area, I heard a strange shuffling. We have a lot of cats outside though. I wasn't too alarmed. There's one window at the side of my house that faces the front lawn spots, but it's blocked off by a large entertainment system. It's the only blocked window I have, and besides my bedroom window, it's also the only one not visible from the Ring camera, but all my windows are always locked overnight. The next morning when I was leaving for work, the window screens were both removed and placed beneath the windows. There was handprints smudged all over the glass. There was no clear footprints, just deep muddy sloshes. I filed another report, and they were similarly unhelpful, basically telling me I needed a camera and to stay up to make sure I could see it happen and call in. I didn't even bother contacting Walmart again. They were totally useless. The last thing to happen was when my BF was coming over pretty late. He worked a long day. He came up around 3 a.m. I knew he was coming, but I was woken up by loud fighting outside. He had pulled into the parking lot, and this guy was underneath my car. He scrambled under when the car was pulling in. My boyfriend pretended to walk to the fire and watched him slide out and try to hide behind the parked cars, but it looked like he was messing with my car. He had him pinned, and I called the police. There was an air tag taped under my car. He was trying to track me away from my house. The guy was arrested with other charges too. I didn't hear anything else from it. I gave statements and incident report numbers and was told I might need to testify, but it's never happened. I haven't had any incidents since then, though. It was Christmas Eve day, 2017. My parents had an emergency and had to leave to go to the hospital as my grandfather was having some medical complications. I'm not sure exactly what he was dealing with, but it must have been serious because my parents drove my 2 other siblings and I to my aunt and uncle's house, which wasn't too far from where we lived at the time. As my siblings and I said our hellos to the family, my parents gave my aunt and uncle all of our presents so that during Christmas morning we could open them, even without our parents there. Now, I'm not usually a depressed person, but when I had to celebrate Christmas while my parents were somewhere in another state, I definitely felt lonely and sad. My cousin and I are super close, so while my brother and sister spent the night on their phones, my cousin and I played 20 rounds of Injustice 2. Almost an hour went by when we decided to do something else. We went upstairs and started to read comics. My cousin's family is rich, so every time we meet, he would always have a truck full of comics, video games, etc. It's always annoying, and to be honest, I was always jealous. The first thing he did was show me his new monthly box of comics. He wouldn't shut up about how amazing each comic was, and I just wanted to scream. I told him I had to use the bathroom and walked to the bathroom. I stood in front of the sink and pulled out my phone. Scrolling through Instagram and YouTube proved fruitless as it seemed that all the people I was subscribed to weren't uploading. I decided to turn to true scary story videos for the rest of the night to keep me occupied and my mind off of the whole situation. Christmas morning was quite possibly the worst day of my life. My cousin woke up at 5 in the morning. He woke everyone up, and we all proceeded to the living room where almost half the floor was covered in presents for my one cousin. My aunt and uncle brought out my siblings and I's presents. We finished opening them within 5 minutes. I got 4 things, not including candy, socks, and underwear. 2 comic books, an airsoft mask, and a book. Meanwhile, my cousin wasn't even halfway finished with opening his presents. Nintendo Switch, iPhone 8, a new $400 video camera. You name it, he freaking had it. Around noon, my parents called and explained that they wouldn't be coming home for another day. This day was just getting better and better. I decided to take a walk and headed outside. My cousin's house leads out to a small patch of woods. It was snowing pretty heavily when I started to walk into the woods. All I could think about was wanting to go home and be with my parents. My cousin didn't follow me out to the woods, which was odd, as it always seemed he followed me around everywhere. Probably playing his new video games, I told myself. I rolled my eyes and walked into the woods. Walking through the woods with nothing but a windbreaker on usually would have cut my depressing walk short. But since I was filled with anger and frustration, I decided that I would rather freeze to death than see my cousin playing with all his new things. Petty as it sounds, I was not happy, and at the moment I didn't want to even think about him, or my aunt or uncle, or the stupid fact that I was a day's walk from my house. The woods were small and went about half a mile deep before coming out the other side to a random highway street. About 100 feet or so into my walk, I came upon this little opening in the woods. 2 logs sat parallel to each other with a small pit in the middle, separating the 2 logs. It was a little fire pit that my cousin said the other teenagers around his neighborhood used to smoke, drink, and do other things away from their parents. I sat down on the rotting log for a minute to catch my breath before looking over to spot a long stick. I picked up the stick and walked over to a nearby tree. Gripping the stick, I swung it at the tree. In my mind, I was yelling, screaming, swearing about the whole situation. I hated it all. The stick broke on the first hit. I stood there at the tree for a second, listening. From the distance, I could hear the broken stick hit the dead leaves. I threw down the remaining part of the stick and turned around to sit back down. It wasn't even 5 minutes when I heard a thump on the dead leaves. At first, I ignored it. It was probably some animal. It wasn't until the third or fourth thump that I started to take notice, each one getting closer and closer. When I heard the fifth thump, I stood up and began to scan the surrounding woods. Nothing. I called out, "Is there someone there?" Silence. I'm not normally a paranoid person, but lately I had been somewhat on edge. I stood there silently waiting until another thump. This time the thump sounded closer than ever, almost as if the thump had come from right behind me. I took off running. I didn't look back. I didn't wait to see if another thump would follow, and I didn't even stop to think until I was back at my cousin's house. I burst through the door and was met with not only my aunt and uncle, but my parents, who used the excuse of not coming home until the next day to surprise us. We got home, and I thought nothing of what had happened in the woods until I got a text that sent me into panic mode. It was around 10. I had just gotten out of the shower when I heard my phone buzzing on the sink. It was my cousin asking, "When you went on your walk, did you happen to see anybody suspicious?" I texted back, "No." It took him a little longer to reply, but his next message said, "Whenever you guys left, my parents noticed some guy staring at our house from the woods." I could feel the panic rising. I texted back quickly, "What did he look like?" "Homeless," he said, and that was it. Any attempt I made to try to get more answers was pointless, as my cousin seemed to stop answering me. He still doesn't answer my questions even to this day. I would be lying if I said we ever heard anything about that random homeless guy. I don't know what intentions this guy had, and I don't think I ever will. It just makes me wonder, what was that guy doing in the woods, and what would have happened if I still ignored those thumps? Either way, I'm glad I was as paranoid as I was that day, because that paranoia might have just saved my life. About 4 months ago, I began to hear strange things from friends around my neighborhood. For context, I am 17 and live in a nice and expensive neighborhood with my mother and sister. Around 5 every day, I would take my dog out to a nearby park where there would be around 5-10 people there with their dogs every day at the same time. I would have casual conversation with the occasional political argument, but for the most part, it was all very casual and relaxed. One day, I arrived at the park with my dog, who was eager to play. I walked in and said hello. I knew almost everyone there and had memorized all the names of their dogs. I walk into a conversation about strange occurrences that have been happening around the neighborhood. I hear first-hand accounts of strange and terrifying things that have been happening in people's backyards. I hear about someone who swears they say someone run through their backyard in the middle of the night. I hear someone say they walked out to their backyard to find a dead squirrel and human shit. I also hear about one guy who says he walked out with his dog into his backyard at night, only for his dog to start frantically barking and cowering for no apparent reason. All these people live around 30 seconds away from me, so naturally I was interested and quite worried. I get home that day and talk to my mother about all this, and she tells me how she has been seeing many sketchy people around lately. At the time, I had been given lots of homework from school, so I ignored it, hoping nothing would happen to us. A few weeks later, I am on Christmas break and have 2 weeks off school. I am sleeping at 4 a.m. every night and playing a lot of video games. One night, I hear my phone vibrating. I got to check it and see that is my sister. I answer to hear her frantically telling me to come downstairs. I get up from my desk and run downstairs to see if everything is okay. As soon as I get down, I see both my cats and my dog staring out into my backyard, and my sister standing back in fear. I run up to her and ask if everything is okay, knowing something is clearly wrong. She tells me, in vivid detail, how she was doing work on her laptop when she sees our dog get up and bark at the window. She says that when she looked out, she saw a tall figure staring directly into the house. I immediately ran and grabbed a baseball bat and ran back to window. For the next 30 minutes, my sister and I stared out into the pitch black in complete silence. As I clenched the bat, I thought about what could have happened. Could it have been nothing? Could it have just been an animal that my sister thought was a person? Because I never saw anything I could not tell you. All I know is that the look on my sister's and my pet's faces meant something was out there.